We are in Deuteronomy chapter 33 this morning, and I am hoping to finish the book today. Chapter 34 isn't very long, so try to knock them both out in one go. In chapter 33, which we read at the end of last week's class, Moses is blessing the 12 tribes of Israel. I almost said Jacob by mistake because, we noted last week that this is actually quite similar to Genesis chapter 49, where Jacob blesses his 12 sons. Now, in one sense, of course, Moses is the last of the patriarchs. But of course, he is also the first in a series of prophets that Deuteronomy 18 talks about, that the Lord will raise up a prophet like me from among you, from your countrymen, you shall listen to him. Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15. Moses is called the man of God in verse 1 of chapter 33. And here, again, we're going to read through some sections of this and comment on them as we go. This is the blessing which Moses, the man of God, blessed the sons of Israel before his death. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned on them from Mount Seir. He shone from Mount Paran. He came from the midst of 10,000 holy ones. At his right hand there was flashing lightning for them. Indeed, he loves the people. All your holy ones are in your hand, and they followed in your steps. Everyone receives of your words. Moses charged us with a law, a possession for the assembly of Jacob, and he was king in Jeshurun when the heads of the people were gathered, the tribes of Israel together." Now, what major event is this talking about here? Those first few verses. Don't everybody speak up at once. Mark's not here, so y'all are going to have to pick up his slack. The question was, what event is being described in these opening 5 verses in chapter 33? Okay, yeah, this is God's appearance at Mount Sinai, and where God gave Israel the law. In fact, this is the only time in the book of Deuteronomy that it's called Mount Sinai. Everywhere else in the book he refers to it as Mount Horeb. Interesting little factoid. There's this picture of God coming from the mountain in absolute splendor and glory, and his appearance is terrifying. We have similar descriptions like this elsewhere in the Bible. For instance, in Judges chapter 5, in verses 4 and 5, "Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth quaked, the heavens also dripped. Even the clouds dripped water. The mountains quaked at the presence of the Lord. This Sinai at the presence of the Lord, the God of Israel." In Habakkuk chapter 3, in verses 3 through 6, the answer to the age-old question of where does God come from, in Habakkuk 3, it says that God comes from Teman, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His radiance is like the sunlight. He has rays flashing from his hand, and there is the hiding of his power. Before him goes pestilence, and plague comes after him. He stood and surveyed the earth. He looked and startled the nations. Yes, the perpetual mountains were shattered. The ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. And we could look at other passages like this. The idea is that anytime God appears, it's terrifying. The mountains are quaking, and the thunder and the lightning and all that. It says that God comes from the midst of 10,000 holy ones. Reference to an angelic army. Interestingly, this passage was alluded to in the book of 1 Enoch, a work that's outside the Bible. But then Enoch, in turn, is quoted in Jude in verses 14 and 15, when he says that, "Behold, the Lord will come with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." Jude 14 and 15. Yes?
It's interesting that heaven is described as God is his light.
Mm-hmm.
And there
terror, in other words.
Yeah. Restored from what it was in the Garden of Eden.
There's definitely something to that, I mean, on one hand, yes, it's really awesome. Heaven is, again, going to be an awesome appearance of God, but it's not the same kind of terror that you see in these other places. It's like the Hebrew author talks about in Hebrews chapter 12. You have not come to the mountain that can be touched. You have not come to the mountain that, it says in Hebrews chapter 12, in verse... I'll just read it. I can't quote it. For you have not come to a mountain that can be touched, and to a blazing fire, and to darkness and gloom and whirlwind, and to the blast of a trumpet and the sound of words, which sound was such that those who heard begged that no further word be spoken to them. But they could not bear the command, if even a beast touches the mountain, it will be stoned. And so terrible was the sight that Moses said, I am full of fear and trembling. But, verse 22, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, or 10,000s of angels, and to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood which speaks better than the blood of Abel. There is this end, if you will, to the kind of terror that God had in His appearances beforehand. And because, now man has been cleansed, hasn't he? He no longer has reason to be afraid in the presence of God. It's interesting that the angels are mentioned, the holy ones, they're called here in verse 2. It's one of the few passages in the Bible that mentions the appearance of angels at Mount Sinai. We might also think of Acts 7 and verse 53, where Stephen talks about the law that was ordained by angels, or Galatians 3 and verse 19. What we see here is that in verse 3, it says that God loves the people. All your holy ones are in your hand. They followed in your steps. And then the second part of verse 3 through verse 5 describes the reaction of the people. Moses gave the law that God gave to him. He was king in Jeshurun, verse 5. That's actually grammatically ambiguous. My Bible capitalizes it to show that it's God, but it seems pretty clear from reading everywhere else in the Old Testament that God is king. Exodus 15 and verse 18, the Lord shall reign forever and ever. And here he kind of combines the roles of the king and the lawgiver. Jeshurun is, we've already noted, a less common name for Israel. Now, when we read through the list of blessings that he gives to the specific tribes in Deuteronomy 33, who's missing from the list? Simeon. Why is Simeon missing? What happened? Did they just get rid of the tribe or something? Nobody answered the why. They just noted that Simeon is missing. Okay, and there's a couple of possibilities. If you remember back in Genesis 49, whenever Jacob is blessing his sons, Reuben doesn't really get a blessing. Reuben is cursed. He loses his preeminence. Simeon and Levi don't get a blessing either. They are cursed. He says they will be scattered throughout Israel because what? Because they slew men in their anger. And here, in this list of blessings in Deuteronomy 33, we see that Levi gets a rather extensive blessing, but Simeon does not. In fact, if you remember back when we covered numbers and we looked at the census, one of the things we mentioned in passing is that Simeon's numbers greatly dropped from Numbers 1 to Numbers 26. There was a significant reduction. I can't remember. I had a note as to how much it actually was. Simeon lost over 37,000 people. That's what it was. 37,000. Granted, of course, that assumes that we're reading the numbers correctly in the first place. But if we look at this, it was likely that they were involved in the sin of Peor in Numbers chapter 25 in verse 14. In Numbers 25 and verse 14, It says that now the name of the slain man of Israel who was slain with the Midianite woman was Zimri, the son of Salu, a leader of a father's household among the Simeonites. Remember that the guy where Phinehas took the spear and he impaled the man who was taking the Midianite woman into his tent? That man was from the tribe of Simeon. Apparently, the inferences that we could make is that Simeon was largely the tribe that was involved in the sin of Peor, where Israel intermarried with the Midianites and was seduced to idolatry. And so, when we start reading the tribal allotments later on in the Bible, you'll notice that in Joshua chapter 19, whenever Simeon gets a certain number of cities among the tribes of Israel, almost all of those cities are also cities that can be found in the tribe of Judah in Joshua chapter 15. So Simeon kind of gets absorbed into Judah. It doesn't really get a land or an inheritance on its own. There's that. Those are just some ideas there, and we may not know the exact reason why he's not mentioned, but those are some ideas to think about anyway. It says something to us too. We need to be careful. Just because God has quote-unquote guaranteed us an inheritance doesn't mean that it can't be taken away from us, right? We can still lose that. A whole tribe vanishes like that. Now, let's go through the blessings. Verse 6, may Reuben live and not die, nor his men be few. Now, how do we interpret that? The translation of the second line could also just simply be, but let his men be few, which isn't a very nice thing to say again. It's not a blessing. And if it's the former, it's a prayer for Reuben to increase, but if it's the latter, it's a reminder of the curse on Reuben from Genesis 49. This regarding Judah, so he said, verse 7, hear, O Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him to his people. With his hands he contended for them. May you be a help against his adversaries. So what is the blessing promised for Judah in a nutshell? They had lots of land, okay. All right. But what is the verse 7 talking about? Is it talking about land necessarily? Or okay. Help his people, be a help against, help in general context? Is he going to help them, paint their porch, or is he going to help them? Lead the people where? What's it say at the end of verse 7? Help against his adversary, which implies that he's leading them into battle. The idea, Judah is called to be protected in battle here, which, if you'll remember again, the order in which the tribes marched out, who was at the front? Judah. Yeah, Judah was the one that was supposed to lead them in battle. So, this blessing is wholly appropriate. Protection for Judah to be protected in battle. Verses 8 through 11, we have Levi, one of the longer blessings. Of Levi, he said, let your Thummim and your Urim belong to your godly man, whom you proved at Massah, with whom you contended at the waters of Meribah, who said of his father and his mother, I did not consider them. And he did not acknowledge his brothers, nor did he regard his own sons. For they observed your word and kept your covenant. They shall teach your ordinances to Jacob, and your law to Israel. They shall put incense before you, and whole burnt offerings on your altar. O Lord, bless his substance, and accept the work of his hands. Shatter the loins of those who rise up against him, and those who hate him, so that they will not rise again. Now, what kind of blessings does he promise for Levi here? What does all this sound like? Don? They're going to be priests of the Lord. Yeah, well, Levi is the tribe from which the priests came, so, it's understandable. Now, there's a statement in here. He said of his father and mother, I did not consider them, and he did not acknowledge his brothers, nor regard his own sons, in verse 9. What do you figure that's talking about? Okay. Well, let's ask this. Anybody else got another idea? When would Levi have... Let me ask you this. Is verse 9, is that necessarily a bad thing when it says he did not acknowledge his brothers, he did not consider his father and mother? Don.
One other thing. I mean, we can go over where Jesus is talking about his father and his mother.
Okay, all right. So if anyone wants to be a disciple, he must hate his father and mother and brother and sister and all those people in Luke 14 and verse 26. When did Levi ever do that? Anybody remember? No, not with Joseph. Well, Reuben wasn't really the voice of reason. He was the voice of get back into my father's good graces in Genesis 37. But no. Think about it more in the context of the tribe of Levi, not the person. The person Levi didn't seem like he was that great of a guy. But the tribe of Levi is a little different. Okay, they didn't have land. That's true. Was there ever an occasion where Levi was basically forsook father and mother to serve the Lord? All right, we're drawing blanks. All right, back in Exodus chapter 32, whenever Israel built the golden calf, and there was this whole fuss about that. And Moses comes down from the mountain. He sees that the people are completely out of control in Exodus 32. In verse 26, Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And all the sons of Levi gathered to him. He said to them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, every man of you put his sword upon his thigh and go back and forth from gate to gate in the camp and kill every man his brother and every man his friend and every man his neighbor." So the sons of Levi did as Moses instructed, and about 3,000 men of the people fell that day. Moses said, "Dedicate yourselves today to the Lord, for every man has been against his son and against his brother, in order that he may bestow a blessing upon you today." Now that's a really tough thing to do when you think about it. That loyalty to God comes before loyalty to family. And here we see Levi, the tribe of Levi, they have to forsake friends and family and all these other things to demonstrate their loyalty to God. We're not going to worship this golden calf. We are for the Lord, and we are for keeping His commandments. They would rather keep the covenant than consider family. And that seems to be the reason for this. And so, I mean, it's never explicitly said this is the reason that Levi became priests, but it is hinted at a couple of times, and this is one of those places that because Levi stood for God on that occasion, they were made to be his priests. And they teach your ordinances to Jacob. In other words, the Levites, the priests, they had the job of teaching the law in Israel. And they had the job of inquiring of God via the Urim and the Thummim. And what exactly those were, there's an endless speculatory debate about. And they had the job of offering the incense and the sacrifice in verse 10. And so in verse 11, their blessing ends with a call to bless the work of his hands, which sounds an awful lot like something Moses said in Psalm 90 in verse 17, where the psalmist prays for God to confirm the work of his hands. And that anybody who opposes Levi or tries to destroy Levi, it says, will be destroyed. Shatter the loins of those who rise up against him and those who hate him. So Levi's blessing is kind of the opposite of what was said about him in Genesis 49. In Genesis 49, he was cursed. But here in Deuteronomy 33, he receives a blessing instead, which says something that you're not bound to the behavior of your ancestors, are you? No. You can go and serve the Lord in a way that they never did. There's a lesson in that for us as well. Verse 12, of Benjamin he said, "May the beloved of the Lord dwell in security by him, who shields him all the day, and he dwells between his shoulders." So Benjamin's blessing is kind of more of a warlike character. Again, a prayer for God's protection in battle. Joseph, again, is one of the ones with a longer blessing in verse 13. Of Joseph he said, "Blessed of the Lord be his land, with the choice things of heaven, with the dew, and from the deep lying beneath, and with the choice yield of the sun, and with the choice produce of the months, and with the best things of the ancient mountains, and with the choice things of the everlasting hills, and with the choice things of the earth and its fullness, and the favor of him who dwelt in the bush. Let it come to the head of Joseph, and to the crown of the head of the one distinguished among his brothers. As the firstborn of his ox, majesty is his, and his horns are the horns of the wild ox. With them he will push the peoples all at once to the ends of the earth, and those who are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and those who are the thousands of Manasseh." All right, so what's said about Joseph here? Anybody notice a word that kept getting repeated over and over and over? Choice, yes, very good. Choice, which is talking, used 5 different times in this passage. Choice yield of the sun, of the moon, the ancient mountains, the everlasting hills, the heaven and the earth. What would you say, what kind of blessing is this? What's being promised here? Okay, yeah, no. It's kind of agricultural prosperity is what we're looking at here. There is an interesting reference in verse 16 to the burning bush. It's probably one of the few references in the Old Testament to the burning bush outside of Exodus 3. And Joseph is described as the one favored among his brothers, and ends with the 10,000s of Ephraim and the thousands of Manasseh. So Ephraim gets his 10,000s, but Manasseh only gets his thousands. Well, that's probably a reference to the fact that Jacob said Ephraim would be greater than his older brother Manasseh in Genesis 48. Jacob reversed the blessings. Well, the firstborn son normally got the lion's share. Ephraim wound up being regarded as greater than his brother. Also, we note that even though Reuben was Jacob's firstborn son, Joseph was the one who wound up getting the double portion, which is why the tribe of Joseph is really 2 tribes in the inheritance of the land, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, verses 18 and 19 of Zebulun, he said, "Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going forth, and Issachar in your tents. They will call peoples to the mountain. They will offer righteous sacrifices, for they will draw out the abundance of the seas and the hidden treasures of the sand." So here we see he kind of blends Zebulun and Issachar together. And what's said about them here? About Zebulun and Issachar. What gets said about Zebulun and Issachar? Verses 18 and 19. What's getting promised to them? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Okay, abundance of the seas. There's again, it's kind of an all-inclusive prosperity thing, but there is this hint throughout that Zebulun and Issachar are going to dwell by the seashore, which again parallels with the blessing in Genesis 49 in verses 13 through 15. Where it says that Zebulun will dwell at the seashore. He shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall be towards Sidon. And it's probably just talking geographically about where they're going to end up or where they're going to be. Gad, in verses 20 and 21, of Gad he said, "Blessed is the one who enlarges Gad. He lies down as a lion, tears the arm, also the crown of the head. Then he provided the first part for himself. For there the ruler's portion was reserved, and he came with leaders of the people. He executed the justice of the Lord and his ordinances with Israel." And again, what is this? This is just an allusion to Gad's inheritance east of the Jordan. You'll remember that 3 tribes got an inheritance on the east side of the Jordan. There was Reuben, there was Gad, and there was the half tribe of Manasseh. And actually, it was really only one of Manasseh's sons that was located on the eastern side, Machir. But even though Gad has the first part in verse 21, he provided himself with the first part. It says that he came with the leaders of the people and executed the justice of the Lord. It's interesting how the wars with the Canaanites are referred to as the justice of the Lord. People want to act like God just is delighting in this wanton killing of people right and left, but that's not really the issue at all. The issue is that this is an execution of God's justice. They have broken His laws and they have defied Him, and He has given them ample time to repent, and more so besides. And now justice is going to be done via Israel. In verse 22, it says of Dan, he said, Dan is a lion's whelp that leaps forth from Bashan. Not much we can say about that. That same expression was used of Judah in Genesis 49 and verse 9. Naphtali, he said, O Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full of the blessing of the Lord, take possession of the sea and the south. Naphtali is just called on, again, it's a geographical blessing, alluding to where his inheritance would be. Of Asher, he said, more blessed than sons is Asher. May he be favored by his brothers. May he dip his foot in oil. Your locks will be iron and bronze. According to your days, so will your leisurely walk be. Sometimes anointing feet is viewed as equivalent to anointing the head. I made a mistake. The first time I read this, I saw locks of iron and bronze, and I was thinking about locks of hair for some reason, and that's not right at all. He's talking about the locks on his gate bars is what he's talking about. And so according to your day, basically it's this picture of security. You're going to dwell in the city, and you're going to keep people out with locks of iron and bronze, and they're not going to be able to break in. That's the problem with English words that have no connection to each other whatsoever. Asher is not Goldilocks. And finally, we have a summary at 26 through 29. There is none like the God of Jeshurun who rides the heavens to your help, and through the skies in His majesty. The eternal God is a dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He drove out the enemy from before you and said, destroy. So Israel dwells in security, the fountain of Jacob secluded, in a land of grain and new wine. His heavens also drop down dew. Blessed are you, O Israel. Who is like you, a people saved by the Lord, who is the shield of your help and the sword of your majesty? So your enemies will cringe before you, and you will tread upon their high places. I think it's kind of cool. The song Leaning on the Everlasting Arms is probably an allusion to this passage, actually, in verse 27. Didn't know that until recently. But the list of blessings basically concludes with two key emphases. There is no God like Israel's God, and there is no nation like Israel because there is no God like Israel's God. God is described as their dwelling place, same as in Psalm 90 and verse 1. And their enemies in verse 27 are destroyed so that, verse 28, they can dwell in security. And we see Israel tramples on the high places. So ultimately, these blessings on the 12 tribes are inserted into a greater context of blessing God. Because it is only through blessing God that we can receive any kind of blessing from God. Now that brings us to the end of chapter 33. It is sometimes difficult to comment on this because we don't know a lot about the individual histories of each tribe, and how they developed their land outside of a few passages in Joshua and Judges and so on. But I want to stop here and just kind of maybe open the floor for questions or comments if anybody's noticed anything. No? All right, well, Deuteronomy 34. With 5 minutes to spare, we're going to finish the book. Now Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, and the Negev, and the plain and the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. And then the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no man knows his burial place to this day. Although Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eye was not dim, nor his vigor abated. So the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. Now Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him, and the sons of Israel listened to him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. Since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants, and all his land, for all the mighty power and for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Now, first of all, we can make a couple points from the fact. What point can we make from the fact that Moses sees the land, but he doesn't get to go in? Yeah, it was. It was definitely the consequence of his sin earlier. Is there anybody else that got to see the land but didn't get to inherit it? Okay, 10 spies. Good. But we're thinking of people that sinned and they didn't get to inherit it. Is there anybody that just saw the land and they didn't get it anyway? Somebody knows the answer to this. Okay, we have Simeon. Okay, now maybe it's not as strong of a connection as I thought, but Abraham, we could say, Abraham saw the whole land. He lived in it for many years, but he never inherited it. In essence, the Hebrew author makes the point that, the heroes in faith died in faith without seeing the end result of the promise. And we too need to look towards the end result. Is Jesus going to come back in our lifetime? Well, it's possible, but maybe not. Maybe you get to the end of your life and He hasn't come back yet. That mean that the promise is void? That you're not going to get to inherit the great promised land that God has for His people? No. There's a need to look forward to the end result. So though Moses gets into this situation because he is frail and sinful, he is ultimately in some ways like Abraham here. Verse 5 calls him the servant of the Lord. That's a title reserved for very few in the Bible. Joshua eventually gets it at the end of the book of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 24. But ultimately, Jesus is the servant of the Lord, the true servant of the Lord. So we see that foreshadows here. Verse 6, we learn that God buries Moses. We have no idea where. And the text explicitly tells us nobody knows where he's buried, which is really kind of an unusual means of departing this earth, I guess. Moses is also one of the few people in history that knew exactly when and where he was going to die, which, how many people know that? What was Moses' health condition at the time of his death? Excellent. He's 120 years old. And his eye was not dim, nor his vigor abated, which Moses kind of evaluates himself back in chapter 31 and says, I'm no longer able to come out and go in before you. Moses is in pretty good health for a 120-year-old man. He was able to see the land. And in spite of Moses' closeness to God, though, he was ultimately mortal and frail. In the 90th Psalm, Moses gives some reflections on man's mortality. I can't help but get a chuckle out of the statement he made, though, in Psalm 90, where he says that a man... Where is that verse? Verse 10, the days of our life, they contain 70 years, or due to strength, 80 years. Of course, Moses is 120, so he gets to outlive you all by 40 years. Now, how's that go? Ultimately, all men must die. Moses included in that. Israel weeps for Moses for 30 days, just like they did for their high priest Aaron. Verse 9 indicates that Joshua had received the Spirit via the laying on of hands. There's plenty of places in the New Testament that describe similar events. And finally, verses 10 through 12, which to me, verses 10 through 12 are kind of the linchpin to the statement that Moses didn't write this himself, because you would have to read it as, since the time of my death, which has not happened yet, until now, the time before my death, there has not risen a prophet like me who knew the Lord face to face. It becomes rather nonsensical if Moses wrote this beforehand. But the last paragraph in Deuteronomy 34 looks to the future. And it makes a statement which indicates that some time has passed. And since the time that Moses died, there hasn't been a prophet like him. No one that knew God face to face. No one like Deuteronomy 18 talked about. A prophet that would come and speak to the people with God's words in his mouth. Now some suggest Joshua wrote that, which means only one generation had passed. Some suggest that Ezra inserted this last comment, as if to say, we've had many prophets, but we haven't had one like Moses yet, who knew the Lord face to face. But regardless of when this statement was made, Deuteronomy ends looking beyond itself. Looking to something greater in the future. Now, has a prophet like Moses come by now? Knew the Lord face to face? Jesus, yeah. When in doubt, the answer is always Jesus. Yes, there will be no prophet or servant like Moses until Christ, who the New Testament says is not only like Moses, but greater than Moses, who speaks the very words of God, who himself is the Word of God, and who gives us all life so that we might choose life and live. That's the end of Deuteronomy. Any comments or questions? Well, I enjoyed teaching Deuteronomy. I hope that you all learned somewhat as much as I did in teaching it, I guess. It's been an experience. The next, and just very briefly in the time we have left, the next few Sundays in Bible class, we're going to be talking about basically we're going to be talking about the church. What is it? What does it do? And so on. Just various things like that. And we might do that for a couple months before coming back to our Old Testament studies. That'll be all for now.